and that's why I'm happy actually to moderate this session now. So we'll be focusing on prioritizing strategic infrastructure, and well, with no wasting no time further, I would like to now hand over to you, Kandali, to actually share a few thoughts from your end as a electricity utility representative. What are, for you, key aspects around infrastructure and other resources for now?
I think the question is, how is NamPower fitting in this whole mix of things? What is NamPower doing in oil and gas industry? So I'm going to cover a few points as part of my introduction, and that is basically that we, as the gas and oil industry, as NamPower, and as the country that we're striving to be self-sufficient in terms of electricity supply. As you might know that we import most of our electricity from neighboring countries, close to 60% or even more, depending on how Ruacana, our hydropower plant, actually performed that year. So we are interested in this industry in the fact that we will then be able to basically mix our current energy supply and be able to tap into the oil and gas industry to basically generate power from it. So I'm going to cover, and with the moderator's permission, the integrated energy planning and coordination, and then the power generation from gas, the grid infrastructure enhancement, the energy security diversification, and technology innovation, and environmental sustainability. So on the integrated energy planning and coordination, what we're saying is that we need to harmonize the planning and how we're going to tap into this new discovery, and how will the country actually will benefit from that. As the previous speaker have indicated, we need to localize this. We need to see first, and we need to serve our people from these resources first. And then we need to basically understand the integrated energy planning, because it should not only work from NamPower's point of view, because there's a hype now in obviously in the market to basically say that most of the power must come from renewable energy, but the renewable energy needs to be supplemented. As we know, when the wind does not blow or when the sun does not shine, we will not be able to basically meet the electricity demand for the country. So we need other energy sources basically to supplement the renewable energy to ensure security of supply in the country. As our mandate is basically to ensure that there is security of supply, our mandate is also to ensure that the Namibian nation is served at all times when it comes to electricity needs. So we do not need in this sector, we do not need to basically work in silos. We need to coordinate, collaborate all the relevant stakeholders, and to basically see how will the nation then, how we can generate power from this oil and gas to basically supply the country. So we also know that there are talks of carbon credits in terms of how will this not then work against what we want to strive to be all green country. But then we know the oil and gas, if you generate power from oil and gas, is actually regarded as actually less, it provides less pollution compared to the traditional or conventional fossil fuels. So there is a benefit, and then we need to actually, as a country, we need to get around the table and discuss as to how we can then basically integrate generation from oil and gas to actually bring the tariff down. And once the tariff is actually down to our consumers or to the customers, that will again attract other investments, whether it's in the mining sector, because then the tariff is low, then they will be able to do their production or their operational cost will actually be lower than us just generating from as the current status quo, and also importing from other countries where we import in and we pay in US dollars, which is basically also, as we all know, where the US dollar level is. So if we integrate this, if we have a plan as a country, if we work together, if we harmonize the planning and not do it in silos, we will then be able to actually have a solution for the whole country, other than just focusing on one industry, but rather to see which other industries can actually benefit from this.
Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause for that. Thank you. I would like to now move to Michael, actually, our first speaker of the session. Before we actually engaged in the session, we spoke with each other, and he also shared with me that, and he shared it as part of his presentation, that financing those activities, the pipeline, and also the Kabalaga industrial park, he was facing challenges to implement that. So, looking at all what all those developments Namibia has in the pipeline, what would you recommend the players, the relevant players, whether that is NamPower, NamPort, and NamPort, what would you advise, what would you tell them on what to focus on to make sure that you get a wide variety of institutional investors to come on board to mitigate the risks, obviously, of the costing of financing?
Yeah, I mean, we've basically I'm talking now specifically about the refinery, but of course equal applies too. But with respect to the refinery, we've definitely noticed that ever since the global discussion started in a big way about the energy transition, that it's really quite challenging to go to the private sector, let's say the capital markets, the traditional capital markets, looking for capital. There are, of course, capital providers who will invest in oil and gas, aside from the actual IOCs or companies that are already invested in fossil fuels themselves. But what we're thinking now is that there's also a general reset taking place, because we've been talking about the energy transition, but in reality there's also the issue of energy security. And then from an African context, there's always that issue of affordability. So as an African nation, we've been having to balance all those three, but I think, for example, recently with the Russia-Ukraine war, the Europeans have also had the price shock with respect to the traditional sources of fuel. So affordability is also a key. I think the other aspect is also about the reality in terms of, we're trying, as a developing nation, we're still trying to ensure access to the vast majority of our population to the grid, or at least to significant sources of power, over and above solar panels on the roof, charging, mobile phones and lights. We really want proper grid access. So there's an issue of energy access for all. There's an issue of converting people from biomass to gas, and eventually to clean cooking with electricity. There's all those kind of challenges that we're seeing. So raising finance, the conclusion we've come up with, certainly for the refinery project, has been we need to think out of the box, and we're looking. This is, of course, under the leadership of His Excellency the President. In his wisdom, he's essentially said, well, we need to start looking at our friends, sovereign nations, in the context of Africa, in the context of Middle East, in the context of Asia, that are understanding deeply the kind of development challenges we have, and see whether those could be sources of finance. So That's kind of what our approach is at this time. We're working on the, let's say, the geopolitical interests that exist that impact the East Africa region, the Africa region in general. And so it'll be public sector led. That's not to say there's no room for private sector finance as well. But essentially what we're doing is working to de-risk the project and make it more attractive to the private sector. But for sure, we're expecting that the public sector will have a majority stake, whereas in the past it was considered to have a minority stake in the refinery. So that's just our particular situation. With respect to the EACOP, East African Crude Oil Pipeline, of course we have a very large IOC with over $130 billion of market capitalization leading that charge, which is Total Energies. And even them having challenges to raise capital on the traditional banks. I mean, of course, you've got to go through the regular issues of having to try and get money in that 3, 4, 5, 6% range. So you have to de-risk the project anyway. But a lot of those institutions actually don't even have the appetite. That it's not part of their policy anymore to invest in oil and gas in general. So you really have to be quite innovative now in terms of how we look for finance to make all these development projects move forward.
Speaking about the latter now, you said that conventional banks may not have the appetite to actually invest in projects like that. Have you thought of offsetting mechanisms to actually indeed make it more attractive? You mentioned earlier also in your presentation about reforestation, afforestation projects to balance that and to sort of make that part of the entire project right from the onset. Was that a consideration, or is that something banks would find appealing?
Pick a box, but it won't necessarily change the fact that, for example, to get World Bank support or to get IFC support for a project, to provide project guarantees when these institutions are saying we will not invest, we will not support any projects that involve coal, we will not support any projects that involve oil. We will now redefine gas as green, so we'll now start to look at gas projects when there's no other alternative. But you've got to go and look what's behind the banks as well. And if you don't have that kind of support, by the way, I'm not a banker, I'm just an engineer, simple engineer. But I mean,
I think it's certainly more than that, and given also the projects you're dealing with are certainly more than just an engineering problem. So that's why I thought I'd ask you those kind of questions, because I think they're also crucial for the development of Namibia after all to get the funding. And we've learned this also from our colleague from NamPort, that at the end of the day also financing from the outside will be necessary. And obviously we're talking about an industry to be developed here which indeed is not necessarily all fashionable with everybody anymore. So the question is, how do you go about this? So that's why I've asked you that question.
To raise one more thing, and that is from a regional perspective, we're very focused on value addition. Right now the EACOP project, we kind of reluctantly agreed to do that because we did not want to export our crude oil resources. We wanted to be able to add value in country, create jobs, develop all the industries that would serve value addition. So refining, petrochemicals, fertilizers, our farmers, our fertilizer, because we're 1,300, 1,400 kilometers from the coast, it's really very expensive to import anything, even petroleum products. So really, these projects make a lot of economic sense for a developing nation like us. But to agree to have agreement from the IOCs to invest in the upstream, they need to have a quick return. And that was why we agreed to the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. But that's kind of challenges we're facing.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to our Namibian colleagues, I would like to actually also place the focus to our Nigerian friend. Thank you once again also for your elaborate presentation. And when I was looking at your presentation, we saw those two images of a green landscape, a swamp, and then we saw the industrial side. Also, I'm sure financing was certainly a challenge, but at the same time, obviously, a big country like Nigeria with 120 million people. Over 200. I speak under correction, yes. Obviously, employment is a key aspect, and also upskilling. You spoke quite at length about that. Now, in terms of, we're talking about energy as a critical source, and obviously we're talking now about prioritizing the strategic critical infrastructure. How does your work and now setting up the infrastructure you have trickle down now to the people on the ground in terms of also meeting the energy needs? What sort of mechanisms do you have in place?
So what's the question?
The question. No, but I mean, we were talking about refineries and other projects, gas, energy systems. How do you get also the energy to the remote people who somehow also have a share in that resource, because obviously it's owned by the people?
Okay. So our focus and our investment is principally in the industrial free zone. So it's a 140 hectare island in a Papa port, and we actually started development in the early 2000s. In essence, it was a swamp, as you saw from the images. And just to touch on the investment piece, I mean, so ours is 100% private funding, local banks with the associated high interest rates. So we've essentially had to grow slowly over time. We do have some support. There's an institution in Nigeria called the Bank of Industry, which is a government bank which does support infrastructure projects by Nigerians. So we've had some of that benefit to help with interest repayments and so on and so forth. But the reality is it is a huge challenge. So what we've done in our particular case with our business model is we have several business units within our larger business. So our power company is a gas-fired power station, which will scale up to 40 megawatts. Phase 1 is 24 megawatts, and that's gas power. And we have various other different business segments, especially around the logistics, and that's helped a lot with the fundraising and being able to get access to the capital that we require. So I think it's really about being innovative and always thinking outside the box. Is what I would say. Fun for growth.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just been told also the panelists are asked kindly to speak a bit closer to the mic so that we can understand you better. So for the next round, I'll ask you to just focus on that a bit as well. But in the meantime, I would like to turn now to Andrew. Andrew, one of your slides actually was talking about other infrastructures, and you've mentioned the airport and other aspects. One of the key issues also Michael mentioned earlier is to get also refined products to the customer. And I mean, a country of 2.5 million people, to invest in a refinery is obviously something which needs to be calculated well to find whether that actually makes sense, or to sort of have a regional integration, as it was mentioned earlier as well. How is your take on sort of additional infrastructure, including refineries? Do you think what are the low-hanging fruits for Namibia should focus on? What are sort of the midterm infrastructure developments you see necessary for the country to move forward, and also as a stepping stone for Namibia to integrate regionally better?
Thank you for that question. And maybe in fact, let me just start obviously by clarifying. I think the statement that Denver made when he left the podium. There must be absolutely clarity that both the Port of Walvis Bay and the Port of Doderer have a role to play. as far as this particular industry is concerned. Now, if we are to talk about accelerated development, for example, of oil fields, it is one thing to start from scratch. It's another to scale up some of the industries that are actually already in existence. So I don't want us to live here with the view that it's only the Board of Always Bay, obviously, that is being prioritized, but that we are actually looking at both the ports. And to your question, usually, especially our local entrepreneurs, when we are now talking about this particular industry, we are probably only zooming into the specifics of the industry. But if you look at some of the areas where I said there are new industries that need to be established as far as Doderer is concerned, those are the opportunities actually that the local entrepreneurs actually need to start looking at. If you look at the hospitality industry, for example, I spoke about accommodation, I spoke about the retail sector. Those are all the areas, accommodation, whether it's residential, those are all the opportunities, obviously, that local entrepreneurs can obviously focus on. Because this is going to be a phased development. Now, if we have multiple players, for example, that are actually exploring the sector, let's assume that their progression to development will be phased, right? Maybe with the initial ones, a lot of development support will probably come from Walvis Bay. But there is no need, especially for engineering services, but there is no need, there is no reason why other non-engineering services that are actually easier to put up that we can actually not exploit those. Now, you talk about possible investment in the refineries. I think that is a space that I'm not properly qualified to speak about. But in my personal views, from the experiences out there, one of in my presentation I indicated that we expect especially activities probably to scale up during development and scale down during the production phase. It's very highly unlikely that as a country we would probably be putting up a refinery purely because of the economics and nothing else. But yes, it's a good sign and initiative, I think, from the Namibian government, where we are looking at the possibility of partnering with Angola to ensure that we put up some of those refineries and so on. Which means, for example, once we get to production, assuming that there is no refinery that is actually built either on shore, in all likelihood, some of that crude oil will be transported directly from the oil fields to where there is a refinery, and not necessarily might be back into Namibia, given the economics that surround it. But over the next 20, 25, 40 years, because these are multiple projects, there is so much that really, I think, the ordinary Namibians, through our enterprises, local entrepreneurs, can actually benefit from by investing in all the other supporting industries and so on. Yes, international airport, I listed it there. If you look at the port of Walvis Bay, it's already at an international level. Once you get to development, especially, there will be increased activities in terms of the number of experts, probably, that obviously need to come to work in the oil field. But those are also the opportunities that there is no reason why we can't actually look at the possibility of upgrading the airport facilities in Doderer. So we really need to look at the business case for the various industries. But in my perspective, there are several low-hanging fruits that are not necessarily directly in the oil and gas sector specifically, but in the supporting industries that we need to embrace.
Thank you very much. Yeah, obviously those low-hanging fruits obviously would benefit not only the oil and gas industry, but also other industries. And in the earlier session, about upskilling and skills development, we were talking also about sort of the integration of different perspectives, and that sort of development plans need to sort of focus not only on specific silos, but sort of integrate that. And so with that, I come over to you, Kandali. With regards to those low-hanging fruits and those critical infrastructures to be developed, we also obviously will see a risk of the Dutch disease or the resource curse, in terms of that all people will then run, or money will be put to certain infrastructure to support one industry, then jeopardizing other sectors. How do you think also would affect NamPower as an organization? Would that also other utilities in the countries would be impacted through that, because of that?
Thank you for that question. And as I think in my first submission, I've alluded to a coordinated approach, other than approaching this in silos. So a coordinated approach, we will then be able to identify where we have issues, where we are lacking as a country, and where we actually need to basically put up or maybe import skills, or the coordination, the coordinated. And what we need is power. We need to have a diversification of power. We don't just want to have renewable, a system that is dominated by renewables. We need it, to complement it with, fossil fuels or with gas or oil-generated power. But then if we're just planning in silos, we will then leave some areas actually untouched, and that will actually then come and bite us later. So we need a coordinated approach where we have a committee working on how each sector will be affected by this, and how would you want to tap into this, and how would you want to improve what is currently happening. And that also will then inform the policy, the regulatory framework, because at the moment we do not have a regulatory framework in place. So once we have that coordinated approach, we will then have an opportunity and to make an informed decision as to how we would want, our policy pertaining to this new discovery, how we would actually want it, to be crafted. So and what I emphasize on moderator is basically on the coordinated approach, rather than us working in silos, and also to see how are we going to work, what are we going to localize, what skills do we currently have, because we might have skills that we actually do not know about that can actually positively contribute to this. And where do we need to go into public-private partnership, as we have a new act on public-private partnership? How are we going to work together with all the developed frameworks that are actually currently in place? So it's a coordinated approach, and basically that will actually be able to get us there, so that we make sure that we cross all the T's and we dot all the I's, going forward.
Thank you very much. Now, as I can see, people are starting to get a bit edgy. It's lunchtime, I know. So we'll come to now a closing round with a short statement. So each of you have 1 minute. Again, maybe a few thoughts on prioritizing strategic infrastructure. If there's anything you haven't shared with us just yet, I would like to start again from the very left, from our point of view, moving on then to the very right. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doctor. I just wanted to put one additional thought out there for Namibia to consider. We have a Vision 2040 that the National Planning Authority has come up with, and we are working towards that. Now, one area that we haven't discussed is that, there's exploration, development, production, and refining, but we're also emphasizing going towards petrochemicals, plastics, towards basically materials that can be used in everyday society. I mean, look around this room, this room is filled with them, and all of them are generally imported, in many cases right now, from Southeast Asia. But all of those produce jobs, all of those industries produce jobs and generate livelihoods and lift incomes in the countries where where they're produced. So I think we should also look one step further. And one of the innovations that's coming out, for example, out of Saudi Arabia, are what they call crude to chemicals, where essentially 70 to 80% of the barrel no longer has to pass through a refinery to produce petroleum products, but for transportation, but they go straight to chemicals that we can use in our everyday lives. So I think that's another area that needs to be considered in your national planning effort.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important hint also for us here in Namibia to focus on. We'll look at that as well. Over to you, Andrew, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to get back to the issue of obviously investment into the required infrastructure. In as much as I shared our plans in terms of investing into additional infrastructure, I must just highlight that those are actually aligned to industry timelines, realizing that obviously we are in a catch-22 situation. As we need to ensure that we invest in infrastructure ahead of demand, but at the same time, they also need for there to be a business case. And therefore, the plans are not necessarily cast in stone, and we'll continue, obviously, to consult with industry, and especially those that perhaps that's where the whole element also of risk-taking comes into play. In as much as the industry might not come out explicitly clear that this is the day or these are the timelines by which we're actually going to reach FID, we have to take some conscious decisions and risk to make those investments. And I invite, obviously, the private sector to join us in that particular hand. And maybe lastly, I think on the issue of integrated planning, I think it's absolutely critical. And yes, we can talk about putting up a port, for example, at the port of Doderer. But if the local municipal council does not have sufficient capacity as far as local municipal services is concerned, there's probably a need for reticulation systems for the various utilities network to be upgraded. That automatically also means relevant government institutions in terms of increased medical facilities, capacity for medical facilities, schools, etc., etc. I think one cannot, overemphasize, but I think those of us that are in leadership positions, especially within the public sector, we probably need to take that lead in order to create that conducive environment, I think, for the private sector to actually come in and exploit those opportunities that are there.
Thank you very much. Over to Nigeria. Jide, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I just actually want to pick up on two things that my panelists said. So firstly, I think the regulatory environment is critical to really incentivize investment and for private sector to take the risk that you're talking about. It's critical to have that, and certainly in Nigeria we suffered from a lack of that in terms of there was a petroleum industry bill that took a long time to get passed, and we lost billions of dollars of investment from companies because there wasn't that clarity in terms of encouragement to invest. So that's certainly one thing I pick up on, and also something just to add to what Ms. Iyambo said. In terms of the upskilling and the training, a key component is also to engage with the businesses and the companies that were actually requiring these skills, and to make sure that there's that alignment between what we're training these young people to do and what is required by the various industries and sectors. And I'll pause there. Could you give me so thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least.
Yes. I actually just want to talk on, I think in our discussions, I think at many times we actually focus more on investors, and then we actually forget the end user. Because in all, especially in the electricity sector, what we're trying to say is that we want to make electricity as affordable as possible, and it has to be reliable, and it has to be accessible. So that is the trilemma that we actually facing in the industry. And I think the opportunity as such, where we can have a diversified energy mix, we will then be able to come close to basically achieve all those three aspects of the trilemma, which is affordability, reliability, and accessibility. So that is basically what we need to strive to, and that should not only apply to the electricity sector, but to many sectors where the consumers are involved, because at the end of the day, we also need not only to attract investors on the upstream, if I can put it that way, but also in the investors to actually choose Namibia as an investment hub where they can actually come and put up and set up their businesses. So we also and also this is an opportunity where we will also solve, we want to create jobs and in the country, and that is basically an opportunity that we have for basically local content and to empower our local people, and also to employ for employment opportunities. So as well as on technology and innovation, because with us it could be that if we are sharing information as different industries, we will then be able to see where we can learn from each other than reinventing the wheel. And I think information sharing is critical. And as I've emphasized on before, Dr., is that we need to have a harmonized planning and going forward to basically ensure that we have covered all aspects required. So for us, we as the electricity sector, we would want to tap into this. We would actually want to have a diversified electricity mix or energy mix, so that we ensure affordable and secured and accessible electricity to our people. Thank you.